Let's talk a little bit about the writing process on It's Garry Shandling Show. How did each script come about? Was it a writing staff, or did you come up with ideas? Or
Um, the writing process on It's Garry Shandling Show started out right. Alan Zweibel and I wrote the pilot in like a week in the Parker Meridian Hotel. Just sat there and banged that thing out. And we sent it to Showtime, and they were actually blown away by the script. Then as we started having to do 17 a season, 20 a season, 21 a season, well, a show like that should never have to do that many. Not that kind of show. I'm frustrated as we talk about it that the scenario was such that we had to do 21 of those. It was...
how many would you have preferred each year?
I think absolutely the way that HBO has come to do 10 a season, or at the most 13 a season, has proven to be the way to do it. And Ali G is 6 episodes. You don't need to bang people over the head. You don't need to do it every week. If it's quality, you let it ride. I've always been against time slots. I've always been against structure. And I think the internet is proving me to be right. That's not how life functions. It's not planned. It's not cut up into segments. And if you try to do that, you're doomed for failure, which is what some of the networks are struggling with now, is how do we keep up with other things where people are watching in different ways? Well, I was thinking that 30 years ago. So nevertheless, because of the business model, we were doing 21 of those, and it was very hard to come up with stories about the human condition when we had so many techniques and, what's the word I'm looking for, constructs, and there's another word that show had, gimmicks. And Alan and I always agreed that the show became gimmick-oriented because when we couldn't come up with a story, we could rely on being funny with a clock that would... time flies and a clock would fly through the air, or something funnier than that. And we started to rely on those elements, and we had writers who were hilariously funny with that kind of stuff. And so we started to rely upon that more than the story itself. And so after 65, I was sitting in the editing room one day watching one, and I thought, this has reached its... it's gone past its peak. Really funny guys. And it became a room-written show, writer's room written. And I have fun in those situations. I love to pitch as much as the next guy and get in that game. And you have to be careful. You're only writing jokes usually, because you're not going to find deep story that way. And it becomes result-oriented. We had to get one to shoot on the air. So I thought it had accomplished its goal and just stopped. Just said, I can't do anymore.
We want to talk a little bit about the cast. Michael Tucci, Scott Names, Paul Wilson.
Well, Paul goes back to the 25th anniversary show. Paul goes back to an improv group I was with when I started. And Paul is some kind of just... major talent that to this day is underrated. He's got such a big list of credits, but he's so quick and naturally funny. A great improv player, and it's so much fun to have him around. And I think Michael Tucci and I think all the characters, I think all the actors were good and had to work with less than full character stories. And so I think they had to find a way to make it work, which they did. And that's an accomplishment. But if I was them, I'd be frustrated. And I was frustrated. An actor wants to go on and feel certain emotions and not
Were they
always.
frustrated? Did they talk to you about that at all?
I think they did. I think, and perfectly so. It would be like, I think Molly Cheek hilariously said, my occupation is changing. and it was. Once she was a realtor, once she was this. And I myself would go, what are we doing here? So, I think while it was a breakthrough show and received like an Emmy nomination for writing, the first cable series maybe to be nominated for an Emmy, while for the Graduate episode, which actually then was a parody of The Graduate, but then had the real life emotion of a man having his girlfriend's mother hit on him. So it was a story. That was the 6th episode that we shot. And I thought that was where it kind of peaked. And then it got crazier. And there's something to be said for that. There was recently I had to look at one for some event. And it was hilarious. And didn't add up to a lot. But hilarious all the way through. So it was time to make a change. Just because the show had taken on its own life and run away. And that's not to say that it had just, it was hugely improvised and very late nights. And I would be with Alan just improvising a scene and shooting it and just going completely silly. Enough to where I had covered that completely silly thing. I remember there was an episode where my wife, last season, Gary gets married, and I do refer to those characters in the third person because it's not me. I'll go back and forth a minute, but Gary, as I would even talk about, I don't talk about myself as we sit here as Gary. Got married, and his wife said, "Aren't you going to eat the vegetables?" And all of a sudden she turns into his mother, and we got the mother to sit in, and it's a very traditional kind of usage of substituting the mother for the wife. But what happened is I freaked out to such an extent that it was my mother that I ran up to the camera and grabbed the camera and I said, it's my mother. And I still remember that. It's just as goofy as could be. And, set the stage for going the complete other direction in Larry Sanders, really. So you go from a guy who hosts a talk show to playing a character that's completely silly to now exploring.
Yeah. Before we move on, I just wanted to hit on Gilda Radner's appearance. What do you remember about that week and working with her? And
surely the most emotional point of the series, in reality, and then you realize that using those realities, when you can, make sense in a show, in a story, because she brings it with her. She brings her story with her. And when that door opened and it was Gilda Radner, you could feel the energy. And it was really moving. She was sick during the taping. And Alan was very close to her. I think it was difficult for him. And now I would say, you take a really, truly emotional moment like that, a woman with that kind of heart, being on the precipice of dying and going on a show and saying, "Gary, I have cancer, what's your excuse?" On camera. That's what you want to, God love her, explore. That's what you want to explore. Let's do a show about this. Hard to go back to the other stuff. And she had a blast. So for her, that show functioned great because she just wanted to have a blast and be back on TV. And she did. I mean, it was a very gimmicky episode about something about having Vietnam flashbacks, and we had the whole. Leonard Smith had the whole, his whole platoon show up in front of him. It's like a play. It's like a new play every week. Damn, I mean, they're really different things.
So you decide to move on from It's Garry Shandling show. At what point do you come up with the notion for Larry Sanders? Was it something you were thinking about while you were doing It's Garry Shandling?
Yeah, there was an episode we did on It's Garry Shandling show where Gary goes on a morning talk show, and I think it was Christina Ferrari who'd done the local L.A. talk show, and he went on that talk show, and I thought, man, there's a story about the people who host this show that I know. And I always had that in the back. I said, well, there's another show here about the person who hosts the show.
Was that sort of even in your mind while you were guest hosting the Tonight Show? No, it came later. Okay.
Yeah, never. No, it came at that point when we did the show about me going on that show. It was about my story. But I thought, she's sitting there thinking, what have I got here that I'm dealing with, you know? And then, if I may, I had that idea about the guy who hosts a talk show, and I called Roy London. And at that juncture, I was offered 2 other late-night hosting jobs, kind of like either the one Fallon has now,
right, and
the one Ferguson has now, because Letterman had already gone. So those spots at different times came open, and I was offered the CBS. The CBS one was interesting to me because I respected Letterman, and I had to really consider if I wanted to go back and do a talk show again. I had the opportunity. That was a big decision because the CBS offer was an actually big financial offer. And my girlfriend at the time said, take the money, 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 take the money.
Did you discuss it with Roy London?
I called Roy London up and I said, Roy, I have to make a decision here, so is there a way that I can learn about myself and the world and people and what this is all really about and get down into that shit and the essence of people's lives and how they cover it on a talk show? Or can I do it on a show about a guy who hosts a talk show? And, you know, he was smart enough to explain how you could do it on a talk show, which is not worthwhile discussing at this juncture because it's minimal. And then we started to talk about the guy who hosts a talk show and realized that it isn't about a guy who hosts a talk show. It's the ability to have that world within which you could tell the story of human beings. And so it was never about a guy who hosts a talk show. Some people say it's about a talk show. Well, that's okay because that's the commercial veneer of it. But that's where the writer's room got tough because I would walk in and say, what's it about? What is this one about? Well, Hank wants a shot to host. And what's it? You think that's what it's about? What's it really about to Hank? That show really became a lab for a study of human behavior, and we were all somehow meshed at the right point to study it together, and we didn't have the name our name splashed on the studio doors because I didn't want it to be thought of as a television show. And Roy directed 2 episodes, and then I wanted him to direct a lot more, and he passed away. He passed away the second year of the show, and I was devastated.
Did you consider not going on?
Yeah, I considered quitting. I mean, I still am somewhat lost, not being able to speak to him about this work or that work, and where I'm lost, and am I crazy or right about this moment. But I'd grown up enough that I, took those Roy London moments that were so deeply moving to me and brought them into the show.
What was it about for Larry? What was it that he was trying to overcome?
I think Larry was absolutely struggling while the television side of that curtain revealed his real need to be liked. He was struggling deeply within himself to not be that guy that was struggling to be liked and somehow to be something deeper, and knew there was something deeper that he was on the precipice of. And he really needed love and wanted love, and he was capable of giving love, and all of this bullshit of our silly, impermanent lives that get in the way is represented in that show. There's a Buddhist monk friend of mine who's Vietnamese and has a robe and a shaved head and 2 burned off fingers, and I had him sit down and watch a Larry Sanders episode, and he said, "Oh, everybody should be the way they are in front of the camera, where they're open and loving with nothing at stake. But behind the curtain, everything is at stake, and it drives them crazy." And he got it faster than anybody. I needed to hire a bunch of monks to write the show, because that's what they're struggling with.
What do you remember sort of about the early critical reaction to the show?
Absolutely shocking. Nothing short of shocking. I mean, I didn't even think of it as being on the air, and we had sort of trained ourselves that way. It was a closed set. I couldn't tell you now what time it went on the air, what day it went on the air. Howard Rosenberg wrote a review, and he teaches at USC now, and I just talked to Howard's class, and I just talked about the reviews that Howard would write. And actually, we didn't have a big following. Our critics were our following, just about. So you could read it and see that, and I wouldn't suggest this to anybody, but we would read it, I would read it and go, okay, it's working, because they were actually getting the fine points of what I just discussed the show is. Honestly, that was helpful. That was helpful. Not only the positive accolades, but the idea that they got that was very bizarre for me to read, that they were getting the things that's when I realized, if you really are what you're trying to say, people are going to get it. It's when people aren't really committed to what they're trying to say that it becomes fuzzy, and other agendas like bigger ratings get in the way or whatever. But there's not confusion when you know what it is.
And HBO pretty much left you alone.
Oh man, I'm sorry. Michael Fuchs at HBO at the time, and then at the end when Chris Albrecht was there, they just gave me. They saw the first one. I had the opportunity I had a 13-show commitment right off the bat without a pilot, and so I started shooting. I shot the first 2 or 3, and then did not send that to HBO. In fact, one of the few times, seriously, I remember getting really angry was one of the producers, who was no longer there after this moment, had sent a rough cut of one of the episodes to HBO. Because that's what you're supposed to do? No. That's not what we're doing here, buddy. That's not what we're doing. We'll send it to them when we think we've got it right. I haven't thought of that moment in a long time. And so the next one I thought we got right, Pete Toland came in, and I said, "Oh, this guy can't write the show. This Pete Toland carrying a briefcase and looking like a white bread, uptight kind of guy with little glasses, and he's not going to get the guts of this show." And I sat down and talked to him about what the story was about Larry doesn't want to do live commercials, and he doesn't believe you should do a product that you don't use, and this and that, and the conflicts. And he just returned a script that's fantastic, and then we sit down and we work it through again together. And I sent HBO that one, and they flipped out. So that would have been, I think, the third or fourth one that we shot, and that was the pilot. Then we used that as the pilot. So I had an advantage being able to shoot a couple. I think these people fall under great pressure when they have to create a pilot and then base the whole thing on that. Sorry about that. No,
did you sort of use experiences that you had hosting for stories on the Larry Sanders Show?
I think I used stories that happened to me on the Larry Sanders Show, on the Tonight Show, stories that happened to me on all talk shows, stories that happened to me on all shows that I worked on. Other writers used stories from their shows, and it became diluted enough that you would often forget who did what to whom. But they were all based in some fact. And then I've already mentioned Peter Lasalle, and I like to refer to him as the Deep Throat character, like in All the President's Men, where there he was producing The Tonight Show, and occasionally I'd be shooting an episode of Sanders, and I'd call him up and I'd say, "Peter, is there ever a circumstance where, or is this totally false, where Hank might fall asleep on the couch or not pay attention?" And Peter would say, "Well, let me tell you a little story." So I think, and Judd Apatow and I still talk about it, we were not going to veer off what is basically the truth. And I think you can't go wrong if you stick to the truth. And then you can fly anywhere.
I remember Letterman telling you at some point when you were on that he thought you must have spies in his staff somewhere feeding you information.
Well, what you realize is, absolutely, is that you start to write something about a talk show that happened not to Letterman, and Letterman may say, "That happened to me," and you realize there are generic things that happen about a guest who had one too many drinks or something. And I think we did one where I think David Spade at the beginning was a new comic and stopped by to Larry, said, "Hey, you should stop by after the show and say hi because you just did a great job." And he goes, "Really, Larry?" And that would be like Johnny Carson saying it. And then later in the show, Spade stops by and knocks on Larry's door, and Larry says, "Yeah," and Spade opens the door, and it's absolutely death, him trying to talk to David Spade, because Larry really didn't mean to come by. But, "Hey, how you doing?" And Spade says, "Oh, am I..." And they get stuck, and they start talking about cars. And then we later found out that Letterman had that thing once where he evidently with somebody didn't know what to say, and they started to talk about cars. But that's coincidental. I think there's a story or two that was absolutely true that I wouldn't want to reveal right now, but I might not remember either.
What's the origin of the name Larry Sanders?
I thought I remember it really well. I thought it needed to be kind of a broad, generic name, yet for some reason close enough to my name that it made sense that I was that guy, that people just would buy that I was Larry. And even though Larry was not me, if it had been, you must start to think of names. It's the Dave Johnson Show. You just go, that's not Dave Johnson. And so I just started to play around with the name, versions of my name and Larry Sanders, and it came out as one of them. And that it just seemed right. And that's it. So I thought, I can play that guy. And it's not intended to be Garry Shandling. I think just probably with my lack of gigantic versatility in my acting, I wasn't about to play Dave Johnson. I don't know who Dave Johnson is, and I don't really want to find out.
Could you talk a little bit about Jeffrey Tambor as Hank?
Jeffrey Tambor as Hank, I get more emails, more tweets, more comments wherever I go that he is just the funniest thing that's ever been on TV, the funniest character that's ever been on TV. And I can only tell you this. There isn't a single moment when I was running that show that I wasn't aware that Jeffrey Tambor as Hank could hold up any episode on his own, which says everything about that. That he could be serious, heartfelt. And I had to remind the writers sometime. I remember an episode where, towards the end, it was, I remember this really well. Hank, I wrote that Hank comes up at the end when Larry's getting shoved out, and they take the couch away from him. They take the desk away from him is what they do, and they put him in a chair like this to try and make the talk show new. And Larry's looking at, found the storeroom where he's looking at the old chair and the desk, and it's Hank that walks up to him and says, "They don't get it, Larry. They just don't get it. Don't let it get to you, man. Just do what you do." Larry says, "Thanks. Thanks, Hank." And Larry walks out of the storeroom, not realizing he's locked the door, and then Hank can't get out. However, I remember the writers in that room saying, "Why would Hank come up to him and be the guy that..." I said, "Well, have you forgotten that one of the keys to this show is everybody's stupid, everybody's smart, everybody's bumbling, everybody's intelligent, everybody's facile, bumbling. We're all different things at different times. Hank isn't there because he's an imbecile. Hank's a talented guy who can do the job on a late night talk show night after night. Larry knows it. Now, does Hank want to be the head guy and have his own show? Yeah, maybe. That's a good episode to do that I don't think we did. So Jeffrey could do all that. Jeffrey could express that range. So the writing I had to make sure stayed very human for him, because he could take human writing, make it human, and then have that Hank cover. That's Hank's coping mechanism. It's genius, really.
Talk a little bit about Rip Torn as Artie.
Genius. And, probably truly genius when you say genius, because these are guys that have an ability to show their essence, use their essence, cover that essence, and play some other parts and feel emotion and make it real and connect and do many things at the same time and make it alive. And, I think Rip Torn was always a gigantically respected actor. And he wouldn't read. His agent came in with him, and he wouldn't read for the part, which I respected. So later, when I still was undecided if it would work with Rip, because you just don't know. I asked him to come in by himself. I called him up, and I said, "Would you come in and talk to me?" And he did. And he sat in my office just with me. And I said, "Would you just read this with me so we can get a feel if it just feels right? But if you don't want to, I respect that." And he said, "I don't want to." I said, "I respect that." And I started to put the script away, and he went, "Fuck it. Give it to me." And I honestly don't remember a more electric moment. And I was the only guy who saw it. I was there in the room, and the man stands up. And he's electric. And he's Artie. And I had to go to HBO and say, "I know, I saw him do it." And he has his demons, Rip does. and you have to work through them, but you get something really deeply genuine. It's so alive. Gifted, so gifted. Tricky show to do. Seinfeld said to me, he said, when I walked on your set, it had a different air about it because you were dealing with all the human interactions of real people, and it was there on your set, so it was harder, in Seinfeld's term, to wrangle. Mm-hmm. And that's true, because you were encouraging people to lose it. At the same time, keep it together so we can shoot it. So it was a challenge.
I was going to ask you to talk about the relationship between Hank, Larry, and Artie. Like, what was their bond?
All trying to get some kind of satisfaction from their success and respect and love from each other. A team. They're their own. In their own way,
they're all broken to some extent. Right?
Well, yeah, they're all broken, and yet they want to be Navy SEAL Team 6. And they haven't quite figured out how to get there yet.
Could you talk a little bit about Judd Apatow? How did you come to hire him as a writer? And what did he contribute?
Judd tells this better because I guess when I was hosting the Grammys back one year, Judd's manager said, "Hey, you ought to meet this guy, Judd Apatow," back in 1990 or something. And I did, and we wrote some jokes, and he remembers them better than I do. And, of course, he would have been a real kid then. And then he went on, besides other things, he did the Ben Stiller show, which I guested on a few times. And Judd has this great spirit about him. And we got to a point in whatever episode, whatever season of the show, where we needed somebody new to infuse it. And Judd came in, and Judd's that guy. Okay, let's go write some jokes. And brought the thing alive. And I think studied the show, and Judd is a soldier. Judd is a committed writer. So when we would talk about something not working, I mean, he says it himself. He'd go back in and work on it where a lot of guys would not. And that gets back to the engineering background and the discipline. And Judd had the discipline. He had the work ethic. And so he contributed greatly to the show, especially, I think, the last 2 seasons. I mean, I don't know if he started the 3rd season, but Judd was always valuable to me when I hosted something, or I would call him and run jokes by him, and still do.
Talk about a little bit about.
I've heard he's become quite a success.
Something about that, yeah, I don't know. But the talk show segments, were those generally improvised, or? Yeah,
generally improvised, and much longer, and then tightened up. So I got my opportunity to play my guest hosting part. There's no getting around it.
And you would have a live audience in there?
We'd have a live audience as often as we could, which was about 75% of the time, but occasionally it just got so rushed that if it was a short segment, we would use canned laughter, which functioned as a shallow talk show.
Yeah, earlier on, we were kind of talking about, when you were writing for Sanford and Son, one of the reasons you didn't keep doing it was that you just didn't know how to sort of keep it fresh and new. How did you accomplish that with Larry Sanders Show, having it on for 6 years?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I was totally aware of that issue. And really, I was watching the Letterman Show one night, and I realized that he had gotten better than he was 10 years prior. And I thought, you've really got to get a consistency and then keep growing. There's no reason things shouldn't get better. First of all, start there. Because people get lazy already and they want to go well, okay, so Hank's dumb, and this is it, and it starts to become a cartoon of itself. And I experienced it from my first series. It became a cartoon of itself. I was just not going to let that happen. I was just not going to let that happen. I can't tell you how adamant I was and what discipline it took, what energy it took.
Do you ever feel it going that way? And if
Yeah,
there was
sure.
a danger?
Oh, yeah. No, you couldn't. I learned from the past that you can't let it settle down. It's like keeping the edge in these NBA playoff games. You're a coach that says, "No, buddy, we gotta play it all out the whole game." So, what is this guy going through that's new this year? And Judd and I would sit down and work on the arc. In fact, when I stopped the show, and when I had already decided to stop the show, we were working on a script, Judd and I, in the middle of the night in the writer's room. It was just him and me at this long table with that dim light at 2 a.m. And I said, "Judd, you think there's another season in the show?" He said, "Gary, do you want to be sitting around this summer with new writers kicking around the arc of next season again?" Because, it's tough. And Judd knows that, and that's why I'm telling you, he puts in the effort in his movies that takes up enormous energy and enormous amount of time from his life.
You worked some of your legal wranglings with Brad Gray into the plot of the show. Do you think that the tone of the Larry Sanders Show changed over the years?
I think the tone of the show definitely in its, what I would say, growth, to keep it fresh, got closer to the bone and dealt with more serious and darker subjects, which was a great challenge and which lit up the cast. And I wouldn't say it was one particular thing that triggered that, honestly. It was more a total awareness of my own growth and what I saw in life and in
Did the show
business.
get better as you were doing it?
Well, it certainly... I thought so. I thought it was more real its last season, and maybe not as funny. Maybe not just balls out as funny. But man, oh man, it had its moments that when Artie picks up Larry's agent, who was played by Bob Odenkirk, just picks him up and puts him against the wall. And the agent says, and he says, "You lied to Larry." And he says, "Hey, I'm an agent. That's what I do. I'm just doing what I do. That's what makes America a great company." And Artie says, "You mean country?" He says, "What did I say?" So you're getting down to the issues that I think are important about what are, ahead of this horrible economic collapse. I'm saying, man, you're making decisions based on money that are going to end up hurting everybody. And you can see that reflected in the last season of the show. Sounds hilarious as I say it now.
Talk a little bit about the finale. You got Jim Carrey and Sean Penn.
Well, I mean, I look at that. That's one hell of a show. I said to Pete Tolan at the beginning of the last season, the last episode should be an hour long. And then Pete and I had the whole season talk about it. It should be an hour long. We should do more talk show than we've ever done. And one reason for that was I was out of steam. I said, "Pete, I can't, I need a break. And so let's do a real closing show." And then we, over the year, Pete and I talked about what the beats of that closing show would be. And then there were many surprises, like getting Jim Carrey and bringing him on. And, I mean, honestly, I look at it and I'm impressed by the guest list, I'm impressed. And Judd had, I think, everything to do with getting Jim to do the show because they're very close. And I had just done Hurly Burly with Sean Penn, and I never have the courage to ask somebody to do the show, ever. I always write a note that says, I respect you if you pass. I respect you more if you pass. And we were on the set, and I said to Sean, would you ever consider doing the show? He said, yeah. And then I wrote that part where he says, "What Shandling, man? He was in the trailer talking to my wife. He had 100 acting coaches, and I mean, nobody can beat me up better than I can." And
was that a hard decision to make, to actually bring Garry Shandling into the world of Larry Sanders?
Yeah, it was a decision that was made. If we're ever going to do it, it should be in the last episode. And there was Sean, and I had just done it. And, you know, I always started with what really the relationship was. So it came right out of us working together. And so that was the time, because it was organically the time. It's a great episode. And it took, you know, we took a season to write pieces of it. And Pete would send me pages, and when we'd talk about it, and I said, hey, there should be something in there, Pete, where he has to see the people that he fired as he walks down the hallway. And he just, you know, he wrote it. And everybody was shocked. We had Linda Doucette back, and that she doesn't let go of Larry's hand as he's going by. It's really great character stuff. I mean, I'm really proud and happy that that amount of effort resulted in anything that's close to being good. Because otherwise it would really be, I can't imagine the pain of working that hard and it being literally bad or meaningless. But then, you know, there would be a reason for that, and we would deal with it. I have plenty of that to deal with in other ways, I suppose.
Would you ever consider a reunion?
No, I mean, Pete and I talked about an idea in which Larry dies, and Artie and Hank have an argument over who has the right to disconnect the respirator. You know, and you could picture Artie going, Hank, come out here in the hallway. You see this piece of paper? That's my signature. I don't think so. I don't believe that is your signature.
On the DVD extras.
And then Larry has to watch on the monitor, on the TV in the hospital, all the people going on shows going, I had such a good time when I did Larry's show, and Larry's going, who the fuck is he talking about, Artie? Didn't he bomb? He goes, yes, he did, sir. His memory seems to be a little distorted. Maybe everybody on Larry King's show has a distorted memory. I'm just making up. I know those characters. Well, everybody does. It is hard to write them.
Yeah, as you were talking about that, I was remembering on the DVD extras, Rip Torn expressed a desire to do a reunion and got pretty emotional about it. It made me think about how interesting and compelling those DVD extras are. What was the impetus for you to go out and do those interviews and revisit and...
I'm glad you asked that, because there was a misconception that actually disturbed me. A fellow in the New York Times said Gary had done these extra features to apologize in some sense. And I honestly don't have trouble apologizing. I didn't know what the guy was talking about. Purely, I thought if I'm going to do DVD extras for Larry Sanders, the DVD extras have to go somewhere further than the show went, period. The only thing that interested me about those extras was going and talking to those people so intimately, like Tom Petty, and leaving the camera roll. It's way too indulgent to be on TV, but for a DVD extra, sure, and see what people are like. And that's it. That's reality television. It makes reality television look very planned. I don't think anybody lost weight in any of those. We didn't weigh anybody and say, great, you lost 10 more pounds. No one had to sing. You know, I thought about doing a show called I've Got Talent. And then each week the judges can just go fuck themselves. That's what I think. So that's the new spin, I think, on that formula.
Sort of, going along with the tone of those, DVD extras you did for Larry Sanders' show was when you appeared on Ricky Gervais Meets. Could you talk a little bit about that interview?
Yeah. I had called Ricky to say, do you want to be one of the people that I interview, that I talk to the way I talk to everybody else on the DVD, which is a straight-on, very low-keyed, not on intimate discussion. And he said, absolutely, and would you do my BBC special? And I said, sure. Exactly what happened is it was in this house, and I was in that room, and the producers of the DVD were told to tell the BBC people we're doing the DVD interview first because that's the one you want to do that's low key. You can't get up and then go down, but you can go down and then come up. Uh-huh. And so when I walked into the kitchen, I realized that these producers were not capable of going from that room to that room and saying, we're doing the DVDs first. It was beyond my comprehension at this point that someone still isn't kind of doing the simplest communication thing, and how people get confused and intimidated. And so we were doing two different shows. I walked in, and he was doing the BBC show first, so he was very up and doing just what he should be for a broad BBC interview with me. And I had come in, surprised the cameras were there, and ready to talk to him on a very intimate, low level.
You were thrown?
And I wasn't thrown because I had already been I was thrown by the fact that only that the producers couldn't have gotten that simple message through. I went, this is bizarre. Now, is this meant to be? Is this some situation that's meant to be to learn or discover something? Because this is just too odd. The man's doing his BBC show when I'm going to go down and do this. And I could have said a minute into the room, oh, you didn't get the message that we're doing this. And so it was at that juncture that I thought, well, let's see if I can get him the signal to bring it down so I can talk to him. And it's probably is unfair to him without him having the knowledge that that's what I'm doing. It would be confusing. And I didn't think it would. I knew that it was going to be confusing. I was interested to see what would happen. And in hindsight, you see something really happened. I'll be damned if something didn't really happen. And I have expressed to him clearly that he should have been informed, and really, I couldn't believe they didn't inform him. And this is absolutely true, and I'm shocked as I sit here. I can't believe it. And then I just made the decision, okay, let me see if I can bring him down. And that looked like, that's why everybody's confused about that interview, because we're each doing our own show, which is then fascinating, but inappropriate for him, and yet I've never seen him better than he is now. And when he just did the Golden Globes, and he kind of went out on a limb there, and I saw him within an hour of that, and I said, let's go through it. You did this, that's why you did it, and so it's a notable risk. I said, I would say it was a notable risk. And he gets better every day, every year. He gets better. That's it. I would say, in one sense, I wish we had stopped and gotten on the same track, but on the other hand, it's fascinating, but it was painful and odd for both, and resulted in this crazy thing, but I'll be damned if something didn't happen. And, I love the guy for sticking to his game, and then I stuck to mine, and it was, an experiment.
You mentioned his hosting of the Golden Globes.
Yeah.
You yourself have hosted the Grammys and the Emmys. Anything to say about that? What's that experience like? Is it being the host of the Emmy Awards?
Well, I mean, extraordinarily challenging, and I've done it both times. Let's say the Emmy Awards with Don Mischer when he produced, and Don gives me great latitude, and we design a show that includes a kind of tone that I reflect throughout the show and within the sketches and the pieces that are being done. So there's a cohesiveness, hopefully. So part of it is writing, but facing that crowd are your peers, and makes me nervous.
You enjoy it?
No. I mean, I think I did the Emmys in 2000, 2005. I hosted the Emmys, and I know in 2000, which is right when I ended the Sanders Show and everything, and there I was doing 4 hours on live TV, or 3 hours, or 4 days, whatever it is. And my buddy was with me in the dressing room when I came off stage, and I sat down in a chair. I said, I think that's it for a while. And I realized I just hadn't stopped. And I knocked the shit out of that Emmys. I mean, I think I did a great job, and everybody thought it was fantastic. And
that's enough for now.
I said, the first thing I'm going to say to God is, can I sit down for a second? So when people say, what are you doing? I go, just catching my breath.
Well, that leads us right into summing up here. What are your current projects? What are you doing now?
Well, I'm debating the stand-up act today, earlier, before talking to you. Without getting into detail, I may go and do some stand-up work. As always, really, impossible to explain the sense I have of where I might go and end up, because I seem to be moving in a direction that captures this transition in my life. If that sounds abstract, it's because it is.
And a role that you've certainly fallen into in recent years as sort of elder statesman of comedy. What advice do you generally give to aspiring comedians?
As an elder statesman, don't shoot a picture of your crotch and tweet it. As an elder statesman of comedy, if you are... how many times have I called Judd and said, don't send that picture? Well, I will say one thing I absolutely love is my friends, I mean, I just will not name them, that are so talented that we sit around and have creative discussions, and it's one of the highlights of my life. These are great, really great people who happen to be extraordinarily talented. And we talk about really serious things a la Roy London. So it all comes around. And I get a great joy and learn myself about where I'm at by helping. And I think I do. I think I do help, and I think I do learn. And I've probably not learned a thing from this. This hypnotic trance you've put me in to make me go back in time.
Well,
next time I'll just bring out all my journals.
We've learned. And Garry, thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure having you in my house.
It's been a pleasure being here. Thank you.
And Bet you this is going to be great. I have nothing to say, but I don't, as I often say, I'm at a point where I don't need to close strong.
Understood.
Thank you, buddy.